Greetings fellow Earthlings and welcome back to Darlingbrough Sci-Fi Builds, and welcome to part 4 of my video series in which I am building an airlock door embedded into the side of a mountain on an extraterrestrial planet. In video 3 I mentioned that I needed to complete the rock face on the back walls, as the top had been left specifically so that I could work out where I was placing the additional elements. For example, the oxygen generator, the communications array, and all the other pieces as well. So with that in mind, that is the first thing that I need to complete now. So now that I know where I want to place these additional elements on the scene, I've started to attach more polystyrene to the model using a hot glue gun. Being careful that I left a space to embed the oxygen generator and the communications device into the rocks, I roughly attached more polystyrene to the back walls of the scene. Once all of the polystyrene pieces were in place, I then carefully ran a flame just over the surface, just to melt the polystyrene back slightly. In my mind, this gives a slightly better shape than the flat faces of the polystyrene. It also helps when you attach products such as plaster, as it just gives a bit more surface area to adhere to as well. Now, a word of warning. Please be very careful if you do decide to use any kind of hot flames or heat or any kind of chemicals that may burn or erode away the polystyrene. The polystyrene can give off harmful toxic fumes, which would be very dangerous if they are breathed in. Please make sure that you are using appropriate breathing apparatus, and if you can, do this in a well ventilated area or possibly outside as well. The next stage of the model was where I started to add details to the rocks using a variety of different grades of small stones, gravel and sand mixture. Having separated the sand mixture into individual grades from larger stones down to very small stones and even very fine sand as well, I then started to apply the largest of the stones over the model, placing them on the bottom of the rock faces. These stones will portray any large rocks that have fallen from the top of the rocks or the cliff faces and have settled on the floor in front of the airlock door. Once I was happy with the placement of the large stones, I then set about gluing it down using some thin superglue. I also find that giving the model a quick spray of superglue activator speeds up the process so you can carry on with building the model. It was then time to start applying plaster all over the polystyrene at the top of the model. As I wanted to bulk up the plaster, I decided to add in some toilet roll as well. Using a small blender, I shredded some tissue paper and water until I had a nice gooey mixture. Which I then added to the plaster and then started to mix it together until I had a paste which roughly resembles oatmeal. Now again, I wouldn't recommend eating this, it probably tastes disgusting. Now just so that you are aware, the blender that I've used for this is actually one that I have put aside specifically for model making. I would recommend, if you are planning on using a blender, I don't recommend using any kind of blender that you would use for making scenery, for any kind of food preparation. If you do, however, give it a really good clean out, make sure it's absolutely spotless, and probably most importantly, don't let your missus catch you using it because you're going to get in very, very big trouble. Yeah. It was then time for the fun part, which was to smear this plaster and tissue mixture all over the polystyrene walls. I applied it by hand quite roughly and quite generously and made sure that I added extra texture to give it some more visual interest. The trick here is to apply the plaster before it gets too dry. Once it dries out, then you'll find it's very difficult to apply it and it won't stick to the polystyrene or any other materials that you're using, and this could lead to it falling apart when the model dries. I also applied the plaster and tissue mixture to the piece of polystyrene that I had stuck above the extractor fan units that would go above the airlock door. Now in hindsight, I should have probably done this as a separate piece because when it comes to actually painting the rocks, I'm going to have more of an issue because it's fixed against the extractor fans, which is not something that I wanted. Once I'd finished applying the plaster and before it had set, I then gave all of it a quick cover with some dry tissue. It also helped to hold the model a bit more shape, make the rocks a bit more rock shape, and just make it a little bit more visually interesting. Once the plaster had finally dried, it was then time to go back and add more detail and texture on the model. Returning to the various grades of stones and gravel that I have in my collection, starting with the largest, I progressively worked my way down in size and added more texture over the model. I continued with the superglue, however, it pretty quickly ran out and I was forced, and I mean forced, to go to my local boys store here in the UK and buy myself some more. I love that store. With my superglue supply replenished, I continued to attach more and more progressively smaller stones to the model. Once I was fairly happy with the amount of stones and gravel that I had glued to my model, I gave the whole diorama just a quick shake just to remove any loose stones that I had missed. And I must admit I was very pleased with the results so far. Although all of the stones and the plaster do not match in colour, it still looks really effective. And once paint is finally applied, it will tie it all together really nicely. I also wanted to add extra texture on the walls as well. For this, I used mostly the smallest gravel texture that I had and sprinkled this over the top. In order to apply the gravel texture onto the model, I decided to treat it in a similar way that I would apply flocks and other green materials. To start with, I first applied a coat of watered down PVA glue to the plaster rocks so that the gravel had something to stick to. I then used a mixture of some coarse sand and some fine sand and sprinkled it all over all of the rocks. In order to make sure that it stuck down and it remained in place, I then sprayed some isopropanol all over all of the sand. Now what this does, it actually breaks the surface tension so that when I apply more watered down PVA glue, the glue actually filters between all of the grains and it just sticks it down nicely. I also added some of this gravel texture between all of the stones on the ground level as well as giving the metal grate in the middle a quick scatter of this material as well. I've done this to add more texture and obviously more interest to the model, and also just makes it look a little bit more realistic. So now that the whole model is dry, it looks absolutely amazing. The texture on the rock faces and on the ground is absolutely perfect in my opinion, and also in the middle it really does break up the grated effect that I wanted to create. The last thing I needed to do just to tie everything together was to give it all a paint using some black primer spray paint. I used the black because for the rocks I've decided to use a dry brushing technique, which I will talk about in another video. As I was spraying, I tried to get into all of the gaps and try to hit the model from every angle to make sure that the coverage was fairly uniform across the whole model. While I'm painting these pieces, I just want to ask if you are enjoying the content I'm producing on this channel and want to help support me. You can do by buying me a coffee. If you are kind enough to support me by buying me a coffee using the link down below, it's really appreciated. Any donations go towards tools, equipment and other materials that I use for projects that I feature on videos on this channel, such as the paint I'm using for example. And as a thank you, any people who buy me a coffee will receive links to any new videos that I upload to YouTube on this channel once I upload them, before I make them go live. So if you do buy me a coffee, I do appreciate it. Something to consider. So here we are, and as you can see, the airlock door embedded into the rock face looks really effective. I must admit I'm really pleased with how well it's turning out so far. Now obviously there is still quite a bit of work still to be done. I need to paint the rocks for example, and I do want to add some additional details to the airlock as well, and obviously the additional external units as well. Speaking of painting it, obviously I will be painting it in the next video. Now it'd be interesting to know what colour scheme should I be using to paint these? My initial thoughts were to paint the rocks kind of like a red and brown, similar to Mars. However, I really feel that that's a little bit cliche. On top of that, I want to avoid any kind of like natural colours that would appear here on Earth. So it would be interesting to get some feedback. What kind of colour scheme should I use for these rocks? Please let me know. I'm looking for something that's extraterrestrial yet still quite realistic and believable. So give me some feedback, and obviously I can take that on board when I come to paint it. Now I have created a small test piece which I will be working on first before I let loose on this bad boy, and hopefully get a nice looking effect that would suit this model. So make sure you don't miss out on that. Make sure that you are subscribed to the channel, and if you enjoy this video so far, hit the like button so that other people can check it out as well. In the meantime, make sure that you check out some of my other videos on this build if you haven't watched them already. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel, and I'll be back.